Hello, and welcome to our seventh part on Unit 1 and Unit 3, Area Study 1, Microeconomics. Today we're going to be talking about market failure, which is all about a situation where the free market allocates resources in a way that does not maximize living standards, that leads to an under or over allocation of resources towards socially desirable or undesirable goods. But we'll get into that in more detail soon. Hopefully you've been keeping up to date. And elasticity was no problem last time. Equilibrium before that, supply before that, demand before that, etc. But yeah, after this, we've only got one more thing to go through, which is our lesson 8, which is going to be government failure, which is essentially market failure, but where the government's intervention has caused that failure to occur. But when we look at this, we're going to look at this in terms of here, the reasons for market failure, including public goods, externalities, asymmetric information, and common access resources. So that's going to be the first part we're going to do, as well as the role of indirect taxation, subsidies, government regulations, government advertising as forms of government intervention to address market failure. In the next lesson, we'll be looking at the contemporary example of government intervention that has unintentionally led to a decrease in efficiency and resource allocation. So first up, market failure is a situation where the allocation of resources does not lead to a combination of production which maximizes living standards. So resources are allocated every which way towards things that just doesn't maximize living standards and might actually make them worse. So you can think of this in terms of we have overproduction of things like alcohol, cigarettes, etc., which make our living standards worse. That can be an example of market failure, and later on we'll look at ways that can be addressed. So the first type of market failure we're going to look at is when markets can fail when there is weak competition. So the government tries to prevent things like monopolies from occurring, because when there's a monopoly, there's one person at the top who can charge whatever prices they want for their goods and services. It leads to living standards being worse because people can't afford as much. There's no motivation to keep quality high. So the government attempts to remedy this through deregulation of key markets. So they remove unnecessary laws that can restrict competition. So they've tried to ease laws at firing individuals. They've tried to implement things over time, like easing up on public holiday rates, penalty rates, etc., to try and make us more competitive in that way. Reducing the level of tariff protection from imports for local firms and liberalizing trade. This opens up local businesses to more competition internationally, and therefore means they have to cut costs, be more efficient to be competitive, and also government laws to promote price competition, regulate monopolies and oligopolies. So the ACCC, or the Competition and Consumer Act of 2010, this prevents businesses from colluding and setting prices higher, as that would not be good for living standards. An example of this is a few years ago, Coles and Woolworths offered discounts on petrol if you spend a certain amount on groceries. There was a point where they were offering up to a 20% discount per litre of petrol if you spent $100 in one of their supermarkets. And this was deemed to be anti-competitive and a form of market failure because they were willing to sell petrol at a loss to harm other businesses, because it meant that they would be able to get the sales in the supermarkets where they'd make a lot more profit. Markets also fail when there's asymmetric information. This is one of the ones I like to use the most because it's one of the easiest ones to explain. Asymmetric information is a situation where the sellers have more information than the buyers in a transaction, which prevents rational and efficient decisions being made about resource allocation. So this can be a case in insider trading. Most common, just general example I use for this. It's not a contemporary example, but just in general, we can sometimes talk about secondhand car dealerships, because we often see them as being dodgy people. Often the seller knows more about that car than the buyer does, and they might hide or not tell them certain things about that car to try and get the sale. And this is asymmetric information because the seller knows more than the buyer. So the government tries to prevent this through a few different forms. So they try and create laws that improve market knowledge. So labeling on food to identify health hazards. So this is like labeling on cigarettes. Cigarette packaging labels are there to give more information to the buyer. So saying that cigarettes could cause you, I don't look at cigarettes that often. So they tell you that they could cause lung cancer. And that is an example of trying to create and balance in the information the seller has, but you might not have. Also improved access to information, so advertising campaigns and resources to improve the knowledge of consumers. So there's educational things that you're doing like health in school to try and make sure that you have as much information about these products as possible. Market failure also occurs due to public goods. So public goods are non-excludable, which means a supplier cannot stop the consumption or use, and are also non-rivalrous or non-depletable. So the consumption by one does not impact the use by another. And this leads to what's called a free rider problem, which does not provide incentive for producers to offer that to the market. So you're probably right now being like, what? I don't get what this is. So public goods are anything usually provided by the government for free that anyone can use, and the use by one person doesn't impact another. So I have an almost 1-year-old daughter. If you're watching this next year, she will be one. And we'd like to go to parks. Parks are provided by the government, technically free of charge. We pay them tax, they use the tax to do it. But local councils provide parks, and it costs you nothing to use that park. And you can't stop anyone from using that park. And you also, the use of that park by one person doesn't really impact the use of it by someone else. But why would anyone produce something that's not going to basically create any economic benefit? Therefore, there may be an under-allocation of resources to that area, which means that allocative efficiency is therefore not achieved, because parks are great. They make people happy. Having parks in general, like areas like nice trails, they don't make money, but they make people's non-material aspects of life better. Therefore, we need them for allocative efficiency, but there's going to be an under-allocation of resources towards them because private businesses won't create them because they don't make profit. So sometimes governments will either provide subsidies for producers who make these goods and services, or the government directly provides them themselves. So things like lighthouses, parks, etc., the government just directly provides them to address this market failure. Then we've got market failure due to externalities. So externalities are a cost or benefit for a third party when goods or services are produced or consumed. And there are two types. There are negative externalities, which is a negative effect on a third party due to production. So usually pollution from production or health issues from consumption. So if you smoke cigarettes, you might get sick. If you eat too many donuts, you might get fat. Negative externalities, a negative impact on a third party because of production or consumption. Then you've got positive externalities, which are a favorable impact on a third party from production or consumption. So renovating your house could bring benefits to your neighbors. So they could have higher land values because of it. If you build new schools, the increased levels of education in the people in that area could lead to greater living standards overall, lower crime rates, all those kind of things. That's a positive externality from production. What the government tries to do to intervene with externalities. So they can do laws, so passing laws that force firms and or consumers to change their behavior, which causes negative externalities. So anti-smoking laws have reduced negative externalities. We've got emissions trading schemes to prevent the amount of carbon, CO2 emissions put out into the atmosphere through carbon credits, and also using indirect excise taxes. So the consumption of socially undesirable goods such as alcohol and tobacco causes much harm to society and individuals. And to try and limit this, the government places taxes directly onto the selling price of those goods and services to try and attempt to limit its consumption or production. So the price of tobacco and alcohol goes up regularly, and they're hoping that every time the price goes up, less people will consume it and less harm will be done to society or living standards because of that. And those taxes work to try and do that. Then we have the government can provide cash subsidies or the provision of free services. So these can be used to encourage consumers of a product to change behavior that currently causes negative externalities. So they pay cash incentives to households installing solar panels. This prevents them using coal-powered energy, which would cause pollution to occur in the atmosphere, being a negative externality. Sometimes positive externalities can also lead to underproduction of services that are beneficial, like health and education. So the government tries to make these processes more affordable through subsidies. So in Australia, we have public health care, a very different system to America. And so in America, if you break your arm, you go to hospital, it can cost you thousands of dollars. Whereas in Australia, if you break your arm, you'll go straight to the hospital because it's free to get it fixed. And that's a very positive externality because it looks after people's health, and therefore they're more able to continue working and being more of a productive member of society. They also provide education and advertising to inform the public. So when consumers or producers have complete knowledge of the impacts of the economic activities, negative externalities are less likely to occur. So we are slowly starting to have more and more education coming around about the impacts of production and single-use products, etc. And so we're starting to, as a public, become more informed about the environmental impacts and negative externalities of certain types of consumption and production. And therefore, it's slowly starting to correct that form of market failure by people buying more ethical and environmentally sustainable products and caring about that a lot more. And that's helping to correct that market failure through that education and advertising. Example of this is we're buying some rock climbing equipment for a local gym as a gift recently. There's these spheres that are made of wood, and even just looking, like you wouldn't expect it, looking on a rock climbing website about a place that makes rock climbing equipment, talking about the fact that like they use recycled wood to make these spheres, so they are biodegradable, they are environmentally friendly, it's not doing any damage to the environment, and that is basically just informing the public that if you buy these, it's not doing harm, therefore it is going to be positive. And having that education there, helping to inform the public, prevents the negative externality of pollution or the depletion of our natural resources from occurring. Very lastly, we have the markets may fail in allocating common access goods. So common access goods include environmental natural resources such as air, minerals, forests, oil, and fish. And these are non-excludable, so you can't prevent any one person from basically taking them, but they are rivalrous, and rivalrous meaning that if one person consumes them, it won't be there for someone else. Therefore, they won't be able to use it. To try and correct common access goods or the depletion of common access goods, the government uses environmental laws, pricing carbon emissions, international agreements, so things like the Kyoto Protocol, and direct action, the government paying to reverse problems. So things like deforestation, the government's actually had direct actions to plant a certain amount of trees by 2020. We also have things like fishing license legislation, which means that people can't catch fish of a certain size that would cause damage to the fish in the ocean and those ecosystems. We also have laws for cruise ships. They can't dump certain waste. They have to collect certain waste and then dump it ethically when they get back. If they're caught dumping it in the oceans, they'll be fined significant amounts because that would damage our common access goods. That's pretty much it for market failure. Next time we're going to be looking at government failure, which is essentially one of these few things that we've looked at, but how the government tried to intervene that actually made things worse. We're going to look at a bunch of different options for that. I've already recorded a video for it that I will put into this playlist, but we might do a new one probably next year because there's a lot of government failure happening recently, which is very, very interesting. But if you have any questions about these or any of the ways the government tries to address these 4 types of market failure, hit me up with a question. My email is below, or you can leave a comment, whatever works well for you. Other than that, this is almost the end of this topic. We'll look at government failure and then you'll be moving on to revision. There is a video on past VCAR questions from this area of study that you could look at if you wanted to get some help in this area. I'll also chuck that at the end of this playlist. On that, I hope you have a wonderful day. It is Friday for me, which means it's the weekend soon, which is great. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you next time. Bye.